They called it the Magic City of Steel, America's mightiest industry, and the United States Steel Corporation was the biggest steel company of them all. A huge mill and a beautiful new city were created out of nothing. The world had never seen anything like it before. News writers were predicting greatness for the U.S. Steel Corporation plant and for Gary, Indiana, the city where it was built.
Never before in the history of the material development of the American continent or its people has an industrial enterprise of such gigantic proportions been conceived and put into execution and carried out as the marvelous enterprise at Gary, Indiana.
Gary is going to become the premier industrial region of the world.
Gary will be the most picturesque city of them all. The Gary of the future will be an impressive, inspiring sight.
The possibilities of Gary are enormous. It starts today with the advantages which Chicago acquired only after many hard struggles. If properly handled, Gary and its adjoining towns may in 15 to 20 years rival, if not surpass, Chicago as a commercial and manufacturing community.
The citizens of Gary sang songs about the greatness of their city. The future looked bright for Gary, Indiana, the magic city of steel.
At the start of the 20th century, there was almost nothing in what is now Gary, Indiana. Nothing except what nature had to offer. There was sand, lots of sand. There were also wetlands. Thousands of geese, ducks, and other birds and animals made their home here. And there was the lake, Lake Michigan, the Great Lake. On the lake's western shore, a major American city was growing. The center of Chicago was only 25 miles away. Nearby, in Indiana, cities like Hammond, Whiting, East Chicago, and Hobart were in place. And there were small settlements like Tolliston, Clark's Pine, and Miller Station. But where Gary now stands, there were only a handful of settlers in 1900.
19th century Americans thought the southern tip of Lake Michigan was a worthless stretch of land. The sand, the wetlands, it was almost impossible to get through on foot and on horseback. Even the Native Americans didn't set up permanent villages, but the Miami Indians, and later the Potawatomis, did love to hunt there. And why not? The wetlands were filled with wildlife, ducks, geese, mink, muskrats, and hundreds of different birds. It was truly a hunter's paradise.
French trappers loved the area for its wildlife. They were the first Europeans in the area. Father Jacques Marquette, the French missionary, passed through in 1675. He camped for about a week on the beaches of what is now Gary. Father Marquette wrote in his journal about the abundance of wildlife he saw as he passed through the area.
The two lakes by which we have passed are full of bustards, geese, ducks, cranes, and other birds we do not know.
The French trappers traveled two small rivers which were fringed by heavy reeds. They used the French word for reed to name those rivers. Over the years, that name has changed slightly from the original French spelling and pronunciation, but the name Calumet has stuck with the rivers and with the region.
Location always played an important role in Gary's history. It's at the southern tip of Lake Michigan, just miles from Chicago. And to get to Chicago from the east, you have to pass through or pass close to Gary. It was even a busy crossroads for the Native Americans. Years after they moved on, there were still signs of the many trails they traveled through the area, trails which the Europeans also used. It was on one of those trails that Thomas and Anna Maria Gibson made a home in what is now Gary. The old Indian Trail was being used as a stagecoach route. The Gibsons built an inn. Today, 14th and Madison is where the Gibson Inn stood. By the Civil War, even with Chicago prospering just a few miles away to the west, the Gibson family was virtually alone in the Gary area. It stayed that way into the late 19th century.
Indiana, the land of Indians, became a state in 1816. One of the state's first efforts was to get rid of the Indians. The northwest corner of the state was one of the last sections where Indians remained. The white man didn't want to settle on this sandy, swampy land. This was Indiana's last frontier. But in 1838, most of the Native Americans were gone, forced to move west.
The white man was still in no hurry to settle here, but some rich Chicago businessmen were attracted to the area for the same reasons the Indians loved it. There was good hunting and fishing everywhere. Men like meatpacker J. Ogden Armour and retailer Marshall Field bought up and rented about 5,000 acres of land in the Black Oak and Liverpool area and formed the Tolliston Club. They built a huge clubhouse near what is now 25th and Clark Road in Gary. It was one of the best hunting and fishing grounds in the Midwest. One member bagged 189 ducks between sunrise and 10 in the morning.
The isolation also appealed to one industry. Because there were no people around, this was a perfect place to make explosives. The Etna Powder Works built a plant here in 1881. In those days, every now and then, an explosives factory would blow up out in the dunes. No one lived close enough to get hurt or to sue for broken windows. When explosions did happen, they were heard and felt miles away. The company did have a hospital just in case a worker got hurt. There was also a boarding house nearby where some of the workers stayed. But that was about it as far as public buildings go. The plant did well enough to support a baseball team, although the team had to recruit a few ringers from the University of Chicago to win a few games. The plant reached its peak making explosives during World War I, but closed down a few years later.
The sandy beaches of northwest Indiana were also a good hiding place for criminals. It was so isolated here that bad guys could hide for weeks without being seen. That's exactly what happened in 1903. 4 men robbed a trolley car barn in Chicago, killing 5 people. For 3 months, they hid on the shores of what is now Gary. It was so isolated, it was almost a perfect hiding place. They were finally tracked down, hiding in a cave on a beach near Pine Station. They didn't go quietly. Over 200 shots were fired as they battled police. A policeman and a railroad employee were killed before a posse hunted the men down.
While criminals used the area to go underground, a French engineer came here to lift the human race to new heights. 60-year-old Octave Chanute came to Miller Beach in 1896 to conduct an experiment. Just a few months earlier, one of the leading aviators in the world died when his glider crashed. Chanute wanted to find a way to make a glider that was safe to fly. Too old to fly the glider himself, Chanute had another man take the controls, and witnesses say it was quite a sight.
He ran down the sharp north side of the dune and became airborne before reaching its foot. The canvas-colored machine rose about 50 feet in the air, soared about 300 feet from the dune, right out over the lake.
Chanute's experiment here and on the beaches of neighboring Porter County changed the world of aviation. He shared his information with Wilbur and Orville Wright and helped them with their experiments. The Wright brothers earned the honor of building the first airplane in 1903. But when Chanute died 8 years later, Wilbur Wright gave him the credit he deserved.
I think I am fully justified in saying that if he had not lived, the history of human flight would have been quite different from what it had been.
The sand in the wetlands kept people away from the area. At the start of the 20th century, the area that was to become Gary in just a few years was still as unpopulated as it was 100 years earlier. That's when the United States Steel Corporation came into the picture and a man named Armanus F. Knotts.
I received a request from Judge Elbert Gary, then president of the managing board of directors of the corporation, to come to New York for a conference with him.
As you know, Mr. Knotts, we have many plants, some of them quite large. All of them had been built up by us in additions. None of them is very ideally located, and they are not very efficient. We are thinking of building a new plant from the ground up. An ideal plant, modern and up to date.
U.S. Steel wanted to build a plant in the Midwest. Judge Gary suggested Waukegan, Illinois. Knotts had a better idea. His home was in Hammond, Indiana. In fact, he had just finished up a 2-year term as mayor of that city. He was familiar with northwest Indiana.
Why not take advantage of the still unoccupied lands of the southern extremity of Lake Michigan, where is the greatest tide of transportation in the world?
Northwest Indiana was located on a great lake. It was just miles from one of America's largest cities, and it was a crossroads for highways, railroads, and shipping. It was the perfect spot for a new steel mill. Knotts was hired to purchase land for the new plant. Half of the land he bought went for around $350 an acre. But then landowners became suspicious of all this buying, and the price went up to $1,500 an acre. In the end, Knotts bought over 9,600 acres of land bordering Lake Michigan for over $7.8 million.
A new steel mill plant and a new city would soon be built on the sand. But what should the city be called? Elbert H. Gary was chairman of U.S. Steel's board of directors. Some said he should get the honor, but the United States Post Office wasn't so sure about that. There was already a town in Maryland named Gary, and postal officials were afraid there would be confusion in delivering letters to the two towns. But a congressman who was a friend of Gary stepped in. The post office backed down. The new city had its name.
Albert H. Gary never lived in the city that bears his name. He was born in 1846 and raised on a farm near Wheaton, Illinois. He was an 18-year-old. He worked in a law office in Naperville, Illinois, and graduated at the head of his class from a college of law that later became a part of Northwestern University. His work quickly won the attention of the steel industry. Banker J.P. Morgan asked him to be president of Federal Steel, and he played a key role in the mergers that formed the United States Steel Corporation in 1901. He was the first chairman of the board for U.S. Steel.
Once the land was bought, the huge job of building a steel mill could begin. Newspaperman Tom Cannon covered the story for a Chicago newspaper.
In April 1906, 3 young engineers of the United States Steel Corporation alighted from a passing train and drove the first stakes on the site of what was destined to become the greatest steel manufacturing plant in the United States.
The job was not easy. The engineers had to navigate through wetlands and trudge through sand to do their work. It was a huge job. The first work crew arrived to lay a rail line.
And the sand was blowing all over. Many days we had to quit work in the afternoon because the sand was blowing so much that we could not work.
A harbor and channel had to be created and dredged on the shores of Lake Michigan. The Grand Calumet River had to be moved. They also had to move railroad lines and to build new railroad yards. They had to level mountains of sand, dig tunnels for sewers, develop a way to get water from the lake, and create one of the largest industrial plants known to the world. It was a $100 million project, an amazingly high sum in the early 1900s, and it would take about 2 years to complete.
The job was no easier south of the plant site. That's where U.S. Steel decided to build a city where their workers would live. A.F. Knotts was given a new job. He was now hired as the land agent for U.S. Steel. It was his job to get the city started. On April 18th of 1906, along with his brother Tom and a couple of others, he came to inspect the site. Years later, Tom Knotts remembered the visit very well.
We got well toward the lake when A.F. suggested that the first requisites for the new settlers would be a site for tents and good drinking water. That day, we located a spot for the first well. While we were there, some workmen sent out by the Lakeshore Railroad started unloading cinders for the new depot. We then walked down to the spot which A.F. designated as the heart of the business district of the future city. "This will be 5th Avenue and Broadway," A.F. said. We thought the occasion was important enough to take a picture of the scene.
Tom Knotts came back to Gary just 2 weeks later, and he moved his family with him. It took them a full day to navigate their wagons through the wilderness between Hammond and Gary. When they got here, they set up a tent. They were the first family to live in Gary.
The little settlement of Gary was growing fast. By June, the population had grown to 365 as construction got underway. Building the mill was the priority. But there were others who saw a good chance to make a buck. Even before the company's administration building was built, a line of shops were doing a brisk business. It It was the only place to shop and eat. Tom Knotts remembered those early days.
That summer was one of great activity. Gary's population increased each day, and a rough and ready set came in with the construction camps. At first, there was no place to stay unless you put up your own tent or shack, and food was not easily obtained. Then Major John McFadden came out from Chicago and started a hotel, which was a long shack.
Tom Knotts also circulated a petition asking the county to officially incorporate Gary as a town. The Lake County Commissioners gave their approval in July. Within days, the town's first election was held to choose a three-man town board. John Sears, Millett Caldwell, and Tom Knotts were chosen. When the board met to choose its president, Caldwell voted for Sears, Sears voted for Knotts, and Knotts, Gary's first politician, voted for himself. He became the town's first leader.
Living in Gary in its early days was like living in the Wild West. There were guns everywhere. People lived in tents. And just like the West, there weren't many women around. The few that were here kept busy, like the women who worked in this early laundry. And they worked under hard conditions to make a home. It was also a town with a very young population.
There were no real old women. They were almost all young. And I was 40 when I came here, and I felt like I was quite an old lady.
The doctors who came here spent most of their time treating broken bones and ailments common to the young. Some men lived in work camps like those in this grading crew, or they lived in tents at what's now 4th and Broadway. Some built crude shacks, little more than a shelter from the weather. Tar paper shacks were the most common kind of house you'd find in Gary in these pioneer days. Tom Knotts and his wife Ella, the first woman to live in the new town of Gary, lived in a tent with their 5 children until winter hit.
We lived in the tent 6 months, and then it leaked so bad, it was only an 8-ounce duck and had no fly, that they just built a tar paper shack right over the tent.
Some lived in caves, or like Harry Hall, who arrived in 1907 to work for the steel company, slept under the stars.
For 3 nights I slept out in the park, on a sand hill. It was rather tough, but I couldn't stand the camp where they had rented me a cot. It was alive with bed bugs. So naturally, I pulled out.
Just like the Wild West, Gary was a wild city when the workers finished their day of labor. The first police department was formed by the new town government. Years later, police historians wrote that they had their hands full from the very start.
The first arrest was for assault and battery, which seemed to vie first place with the charge of drunkenness. During those turbulent times when about all the people had to do besides building a town was to drink and fight.
Those who were here had plenty of work to do, and the man responsible for overseeing it all was William Palmer Gleason. He started in the steel industry at the bottom and worked his way up, and he expected everyone else to work as hard as he did.
I spent nearly all my time driving on horseback through hot sands and treacherous marshes, hearing and adjusting complaints from one contractor and another, trying to keep them from dodging their responsibilities or misinterpreting their contracts. At the same time, I had to build up an organization of my own and lend a patient ear to the laments raised by my men and their wives over the deplorable living conditions: sand, heat, mud, and tumbleweeds.
Sand fleas were so annoying that one creative photographer made a popular postcard of a Gary sand flea in transit, showing how big a problem they were. Tumbleweeds were so bad that the Gary Tribune called them Gary's chief vegetation product.
Late this afternoon, the weeds were piled up to second-story windows in parts of the city. Thousands of the weeds are rolling through the streets, 4 and 5 abreast, going in all directions.
Nature would continue to hold the upper hand until more housing was built. The job of getting the housing situation settled belonged to A.F. Knotts. He was supposed to be selling the company's lots to settlers, but company president E.J. Buffington was hearing rumors he didn't like. He sent a man down to inspect, and that man reported back that Knotts wasn't selling many of the company lots, but was busy selling his own lots, ones that he had obtained as a real estate agent. A.F. Knotts resigned. The man who came down to inspect for the company, Horace S. Norton, was hired to take his place as head of the company's Gary Land Office. The Knotts brothers never forgave Norton and never forgave U.S. Steel. It was the first battle in a war between the mill and the city's people.
He was known as Captain Norton, a title from his days in the Illinois National Guard. Over the next 3 decades, he would be one of the most powerful men in Gary. His job was to run the Gary Land Company, which was a part of U.S. Steel. They owned all the land along the lake, as far south as the Wabash Tracks. The land company set up a subdivision north of the tracks. They paved the streets, brought in rich black soil, and planted trees and grass. They built some homes for workers and sold lots to others. Most of the homes were sold to company officials and to the more skilled workers. But the land company did not build homes that laborers could afford. That policy would have a big impact on the future city of Gary. The laborers were forced to look for housing south of the tracks, just outside U.S. Steel's property line. The area became known as the Patch. The north side was clean and peaceful, closely controlled by Norton's Gary Land Company. The Patch was dirty and lawless, controlled by no one. Attorney Frank Welchheimer moved to Gary in 1908 and wrote to his wife in the Fort Wayne area about the city.
Dear Ava, everything about the place so far has been quiet and orderly. In fact, the whole town seems to be well regulated, except possibly the south end, down in the saloon district, which I am told gets pretty bad sometimes.
Saloons were regulated on the north side, and the only 2 which existed were places where gentlemen congregated, the Hotel Gary and the Bensonhof. But there was no regulation off of U.S. Steel property, and by 1910 there were more than 200 saloons in the Patch, with names like the Bucket of Blood.
In August of 1906, 5th and Broadway was just sand. By October, work was underway to build a street. In November, the street was in place. In just a few short months, in 1906, the city was rapidly growing. The first train depot opened in July. It was nothing more than a boxcar moved to the side of the tracks, but it served its purpose. The first post office opened that year in the land company's office. Before the post office got established, Postmaster Tom Knotts kept all of the mail in a shoebox. The first baby was born that September, a girl, but her parents named her, what else? Gary. The town also had its first wedding in 1906. There were a lot of saloons opened by the end of 1906, but it would be almost a full year before the first church would open. It was the Episcopal Church. Businesses like this meat market and grocery store continued to spring up, trying to meet the demand of a quickly growing population. It was a time of opportunity. The Tittle brothers invested $13,000 in 1908 to build a grocery store, which grew into a chain of stores in the years ahead.
Of the men who were brought by U.S. Steel to build the mill and the city, 1/3 were black. Like their white co-workers, not many stayed behind once the mill was built. But a black community slowly began to emerge. By 1910, there were just under 400 African Americans in Gary, compared to nearly 12,000 European immigrants and their children. The early 1900s were a time when people from Southern and Eastern Europe flocked to America. In their villages, word was spreading about a new place for jobs. For some, when they landed on American soil, the only 2 English words they could say were Indiana, Gary. That's all they needed to know to get here.
The first school met in a temporary building that was not quite ready on October 1st, the opening day of school in 1906. Ora Wildermuth was the teacher that first day.
Went on the floor in the schoolhouse on the 1st of October. The children came, and we had a little session out in front on the sand. I stood up on a stump and took the roll, but there was no place to have school, so I sent them home, and then I helped the carpenter lay the floor in the schoolhouse.
Wildermuth was a lawyer who was recruited to teach because they needed someone. His law office was across the street at 4th and Broadway. While teaching, he kept one eye on the students and the other on his law office. Sometimes during the school day, he'd have to run across the street to help someone with their legal problems.
It was around that time that the superintendent of schools in the eastern Indiana town of Bluffton read a newspaper article about the new city of Gary. William A. Wirt had some ideas about how schools should be operated. His ideas were called the work, study, play system. He had tried the ideas in Bluffton, but ran into problems.
Now, we had been trying to operate a work, study, play school in Bluffton for 3 or 4 years. And his remark was, there's the place to try out our experiment.
Wirt took a train to visit the new city of Gary. He ran into Tom Knotts, and struck up a conversation. The two of them sat on a log on the dunes of Gary and talked. Knotts was impressed.
As soon as he began talking about schools, I shut right up. I never got so many ideas about education in my life.
Not long after that conversation, Knotts offered Wirt a job as superintendent of the new Gary school system.
Tom Knotts had full confidence in him and told him to go ahead and gave him a free hand to build the sort of a system that he believed in.
It was an opportunity to build a school system from scratch. Wirt liked the idea. He accepted the job, which paid $2,500 a year.
Tom Knotts was becoming a powerful man in the growing town, and that wasn't good news for the steel company. Knotts was somewhat radical for his time. A graduate of Valparaiso College, as a young man he went west, where he taught on a Sioux Indian reservation in Wyoming in the 1880s. His brother, A.F. Knotts, was mayor of Hammond and hired Tom as a police officer. This was just a few years after Tom went to jail with socialist Eugene Debs in a protest against the Pullman Company. In the late 1800s, Pullman built a company town in South Chicago and controlled every aspect of the city.
When we went to Gary, I remember my father saying that Gary was not going to be another Pullman. Pullman owned the whole town. They owned the houses. They owned the water. They owned the utilities. And when the men struck, they shut the damn down and told them to go to hell.
In Gary, phone service was operated by Bell Telephone, but U.S. Steel had control over the water, gas, and electric utilities. Tom Knotts was determined to stop it there. The battle was to be fought over a trolley line.
The horse was a big part of early Gary, but a growing city also needed modern transportation. In the early 20th century, that meant a trolley line. Frank Gavitt of nearby Whiting wanted the contract to build the trolley line. He had the support of the Knotts brothers. But Horace Norton of the Gary Land Office wanted a different company, a company controlled by U.S. Steel. The steel company wanted the main trolley line to run east and west down Fifth Avenue. That's where the steel company owned its land. But the Knotts brothers wanted the development to take place in a north-south direction down Broadway on land not owned by U.S. Steel. If the trolley line went south, the city government, not the steel company, would control the city's growth. It was a bitter fight. Town board member Millett Caldwell, a U.S. Steel employee, voted with his company, but board member John Sears had no loyalties to U.S. Steel. He voted with Knotts, and the Gavitt franchise won. By 1908, Gary streetcars were operating, and the North-South Street Broadway, not the East-West Fifth Avenue, would become the main street of the city.
As Gary's Main Street was taking shape, the Gary Hotel was built at the corner of 6th and Broadway in 1907, but there wasn't much else around at that time. The town's first theater, the Broadway, was built that same year. By 1908, the trolley line wires and poles were up in the middle of Broadway. The horse and buggy was now competing with trolley cars on Gary's Main Street.
William P. Gleason, the man who oversaw the building project, would stay on to be the first superintendent of the plant. Even though the city bore his name, Albert H. Gary didn't spend much time here. He did visit several times, including this trip in June of 1908 to look over the plant. What he saw was a huge project that was almost ready to go. After nearly 2 years of construction, the world's biggest and most modern steel-producing plant was near completion.
July 23, 1908. On that day, thousands lined the dock and waited on shore as the first ore boat pulled into the newly built harbor. It was an important milestone. It meant the plant was almost ready to produce steel. The ship was named the Albert H. Gary. That morning it was docked at U.S. Steel's Southworks plant in Chicago. A group of 500 dignitaries from Gary, the steel company, and a naval band were there to board it. 4 other boats, including a naval warship, formed an escort as the Albert H. Gary made its way down Lake Michigan.
The 12,000-ton ore boat entered the slip at exactly 2:33 p.m. amid the boom of cannon, the tooting of whistles, the strains of Gary Land, My Gary Land, and the cheering, shouting, and singing of passengers on shipboard and the spectators on the dock.
As the boat entered the harbor, mill officials wanted the naval warship to fire a salute from its big guns, but the commander of the ship said he wouldn't salute anything but the American flag. Standing on the edge of the pier was little Mary Louise Gleason, the daughter of the mill superintendent. As the boat approached, newspaper reports say she raised the flag.
Instantly, one of the big guns of the United States gunboat Wolverine responded. The whistles of the tugs and of the steamer Gary replied. Then came the second gun from the Wolverine, followed by another and still another, until the national salute of 21 guns had proclaimed to the world that the United States Navy had voiced its highest honor to the new harbor.
Thousands of spectators on shore went aboard when the boat docked. After the speech-making was done, the Navy band led a parade down Broadway. It was a big day of celebration. Captain Horace Norton, who organized the event, said it was appropriate for the occasion.
In the organization of a steel plant, there are three important events: the turning of the first spadeful of earth, the arrival of the first cargo of iron ore, and the lighting of the first fire. In the construction of the plant in Gary, we have reached the second stage.
5 months later, just before Christmas, Stage 3 was reached. Mary Louise Gleason again had the honors.
Armed with a long, white-heated iron poker, she lighted the fire in the first furnace, and the mills of the Indiana Steel Company at Gary began producing iron.
That night, a number of Gary residents shot their guns in the air. In those days, that was how you called the fire department. Some people saw the huge red glow in the sky and thought the city was on fire. It was the furnaces of the mill lighting up the nighttime sky over Gary for the first time.
News of Gary spread overseas, and thousands came here to find work. By 1910, over 70% of the city's population were immigrants and their children. Most came from Southern or Eastern Europe. Dozens of nationalities were represented in Gary. It was one of the largest mixes of nationalities in one place in the history of the world.
Most of the immigrants were laborers in the mill. They earned less than 20 cents an hour. The pay wasn't enough to afford housing on Gary's north side, on land controlled by U.S. Steel's Gary Land Company. So the immigrants flocked to the south side. Unscrupulous developers created terribly crowded and inferior housing conditions. Bars, gambling, and prostitution were allowed to develop. That led to political corruption. There was segregation. The south side was the place for the poor, the different, people who were foreigners or who were black. They made up the majority of Gary's population, but the city was controlled by the white native-born Americans living on the north side. Poor housing, crime, vice, political corruption, and segregation. All of these would become problems that remained a part of Gary throughout its history. The roots of those problems were forming in these early years.
The South Side was not segregated. Blacks who migrated from the South and whites who came from Europe lived together. They shared one thing: they were poor and came to Gary to find a better life. One black woman remembers the tar paper shack she grew up in on the South Side, and the children of other families who shared that house with her.
We had close, friendly neighbors. The family in front were Polish, the family in back were Russian. We lived as one big family. We played, ate, and slept together, regardless of color of skin.
By 1908, a library was already in place on West 7th Avenue, just off Broadway, attracting children and adults. The fall of that same year, Gary's first permanent schoolhouse was open. Jefferson School was built by U.S. Steel to house the city's 600 students. By the end of the school year, 200 additional students enrolled. The school system was already running out of room. New schools had to be built, and work was soon begun on Emerson School. Another solution to overcrowding was to do what many school systems in America were doing at the time: separate the black students from the white. Many educators at the time, including Superintendent William Wirt, felt it was better for the students.
We believe that it is only injustice to the Negro children that they be segregated. We are sure the colored children will be better cared for in schools of their own, and they will take pride in their work and consequently get better grades.
Black children were moved from Jefferson to a temporary school. From now on, Gary schools would be segregated.
Gary was still growing quickly. Housing was so scarce that some moved into their new homes before construction was even complete. 5th and Broadway was destined to become the city's business center, as a big new bank went up on the southwest corner. All over town, small businesses were springing up. The city proudly saw a huge water tower being built. It was a unique tower, covered in concrete. It became an immediate attraction and the subject of many early postcards.
The city also had an impressive sewer system installed, and in August of 1908, the town board went down to take a look. They lowered 3 canoes into the sewer waters, and Tom Knotts lit up his first cigar in 25 years as he posed for this picture. Fortunately for them, the sewers were still new and clean, because just moments after the picture was taken, the photographer and 2 others tipped their boat over into the sewer waters. The Gary Tribune called it the most exciting incident of the trip. Knotts wasn't in that boat, but the newspaper, never a fan of Tom Knotts, seemed to take some pleasure in reporting that the cigar made him sick.
In 1909, Gary became a city, and it had to elect a mayor and council. Tom Knotts was a candidate. Still, company officials in Gary hoped this was their chance to get rid of Knotts. Captain Horace Norton led the company's effort. The Gary Tribune attacked Knotts on a regular basis, so Knotts started his own paper, the Gary Post, which attacked the Still Company on a regular basis. John Brennan, a building contractor, was the Republican nominee. The Democrats called him Captain Norton's stooge and said U.S. Steel would control the town if Brennan won. The Republicans called Knotts the rotund old blunderbuss and called his newspaper the Daily Pivo, a Slavic word for beer. They said if Knotts won, it would be a victory for barkeepers, ruffians, and lawbreakers, which the Republicans said described the makeup of the city's police department. The Gary police were hired by Knotts and loyal to him, but the Lake County sheriff was a Republican. The day before the election, he had every man on the police force arrested. They got out of jail and arrested several Brennan supporters. It was a bitter campaign. Everyone expected violence on Election Day. Both sides were ready for war. A Gary resident wrote a poem.
Now father dons his shirt and mail, his cuirass and greaves, while mother deal, all wan and pale, clings to him ere he leaves the house, his rifle in his hand and pistols in his coat, a bowie knife between his teeth, for father's going to vote.
Indiana Governor Tom Marshall had the state militia standing by just in case of violence. Allegedly, the governor made a comment about Gary, which some future governors probably repeated over the years. Marshall said, "I wish Gary would slide off into Lake Michigan." In the end, Tom Knotts was the winner. He became Gary's first mayor by a very thin margin.
Gary's first mayor never did win over his opponents. They called him a dictator and attacked him as long as he was in office. But Knotts was proud of his city. He showed off Gary's new fire truck. They called it the Auto Firefighter back then. It was the first gas-propelled fire wagon in Indiana. The police department posed in front of the new city hall, but even with a larger department, they were sometimes understaffed to police the growing city.
Police Chief Joseph Martin and his officers spent a lot of their time patrolling the area that had been known as the Patch. Lou Jenkins was one of those early Gary police officers.
The most of our traveling was south of the Wabash, what they used to call the Patch. That's where all the most of the saloons were. That's where all the trouble was, and we had to be there.
By the 1910s, the area was called the South Side. But whatever it was named, it was known as a sometimes wild and dangerous place.
Anyone who went into Gary at that time took their life in their hands because of the wild element in Gary. I remember shortly after we moved into town, my father was going into Gary for something. Now, this was in the summer of 1906. And I cried because I thought I would never see my father again. He would surely be killed in Gary.
Paul Drimley grew up near a saloon at 22nd and Jefferson.
One night we were playing by the bakery in the back of the saloon when we heard an argument at one of the card tables. And one guy pulled his gun and shot Steve and Johnny's father, and he fell dead. We ran like hell. They were shooting like this in the saloons many times. And after dark, you could usually hear shots from somewhere almost any night.
But there was more to the South Side than bars. As one newspaper writer said, it was an interesting place.
This is where the distinctive flavor is to be found in Gary. This is the old world. Streets are narrow, houses of every type of shack, bungalow, and tenement. Stores have exotic names and advertisements. Cafes have distinct national airs featuring tamales, ravioli, or whatever the favorite dish may be. National clubhouses display strange and interesting posters in their mysterious windows. Coffee houses, those rendezvous of the Balkans, shelter gossiping, card-playing men who read papers with the L's and P's crazily inverted. Churches even bearing Byzantine domes, hawkers shouting their wares in all versions of the bewildering jumble of tongues. Children skip and run half naked in the streets. Mothers sing to dark babies strange alien lullabies remembered from European hearthsides. All this is Gary's real charm.
Gary was still growing. By 1912, a new library was built on Fifth Avenue. That same year, Frabel School opened. 3 years after the opening of Emerson School, Superintendent William Wirt hired an architect from St. Louis to design the school. The buildings were designed to be open 6 days a week, 12 hours a day, 50 weeks a year. They would serve the needs of all people in the neighborhood, not just the children. When Wirt's school opened, the country took notice. Almost every major magazine in America did stories about the Gary school system. What William Wirt created was considered to be the most modern and the most innovative school system in America.
Wirt's idea was to make the schools, not the streets, the most important place of learning outside the home. The school day was 8 hours long.
So he had us from first grade on a program from 8:15 to 4:15 at night with hour or 55-minute classes and a definite program that he made sure we were exposed from first grade on, kindergarten on probably, to art, to music, to science, to the very best of everything.
The schools were open early and kept open late. As school board president, May Patterson said, many students often prefer to stay at school after regular hours rather than play in the streets.
One day when I was president of the school board, a lady came to me with a very serious complaint. She said she saw too little of her children when they had to be in school from 8:15 a.m. to 4:15 p.m. She was really perturbed and wished something might be done about it. But I told her, you know that they are not compelled to go to school until 9 o'clock. It's optional. She answered, I know, but I can't keep them at home.
The Wirt system kept children interested by giving them hands-on learning. They learned by doing. Grade school children were learning to use saws, as well as how to use typewriters. They were learning art and science. They were learning to make pottery and how to pot plants. They learned how to cook, and they learned how to operate machinery. They learned lessons that stayed with them for life.
We'd have one semester in junior high in cooking and and the next semester in sewing. So, and I made all my clothes all the way through college and most of my life from the sewing that I had in the Gary schools.
Wirt's system was called Work, Study, Play. Play was a big part of it. He insisted that every school have a large amount of land for playgrounds. At the time, that was unusual for schools. Sports were a part of the program. Emerson School was the first in the country to come equipped with a swimming pool. There were greenhouses where students could learn about plants, and when the weather permitted, students went outside and planted gardens, where they raised pumpkins and other produce. Or they went outside to learn to identify trees by studying their leaves. Each school also came with an auditorium, and every day for an hour, students would go to the auditorium.
Half of that hour was also spent in singing, and we learned a lot about classical music, a number of the operas.
There in the auditorium at Jefferson School, we had a grand piano with an electric player and the very best of music. We spent the first 15 or 20 minutes probably on music, singing ourselves, and music appreciation. And I can remember Wagnerian operas being done and one thing or another, and the teacher explaining the background for it.
Sometimes we had rotated, different groups would put on some sort of educational entertainment as a rule, and be from one class or another, maybe a historical bit of history, they portrayed parts of it or acted out. Others would, like chemistry, would maybe demonstrate some experiments.
The students never stayed in the same classroom, never had an assigned desk. They would switch from one classroom to another and be taught by specialists in a subject area.
In fourth grade, we spent the whole semester in nature study on the Indiana Dunes, and I would rate that program with some of the best that I've seen at the college level since then. We learned the language, we visited the dunes, and came to appreciate them for what they were, and it was delightful.
For a time, the school system even set up a special program called Boyville. The idea was to teach boys responsibility, to train them to be productive members of society. There was a Boyville government with regular elections. There was a Boyville bank and the Boyville band. Gary schools were a place where ideas were being tried.
Wirt's system received national and international attention. Educators from Japan, Germany, and all over America came to see what was being done in Gary. And Wirt was traveling across the country, giving speeches and consulting other school systems on how to copy the Gary schools. By the end of the 1920s, Wirt's ideas were being tried in over 1,000 schools in 202 cities in 41 states, including such large school systems as Detroit, Pittsburgh, Birmingham, and Akron. Wirt also was hired by New York City schools to implement his plan in that huge school system. Suddenly, New York children were getting out of the classroom and learning about the world around them, and some New York teachers were singing the praises of the Gary plan.
One day we went out into the country. I remember one very unmanageable boy. We passed a pond and I heard him calling me. "You see this frog?" he said. I picked him out of the water because I wanted to throw stones at him. In the water he was brown with green spots on him, but when I put him in the grass he was all green. That boy had discovered for himself the possibilities of protective coloring, and after that he was all eagerness to learn.
Wirt's reputation as an innovative educator attracted some of the best teachers to Gary.
Dr. Wirt could bring in teachers, the very best, from all over the United States. My 7th grade social studies teacher, this would have been in the 20s, had not only been to Europe, but she'd flown over the English Channel. And one of the music teachers, I remember, had her master's in vocal music from Northwestern University, gained way back by 1926. The best trained people, and their backgrounds were very, very good.
Any idea that's different will have its share of critics. Wirt's work, study, play system came under a lot of criticism. Wirt wanted to prepare students for life. Some critics said he was just preparing them for a life in the steel mills. Children were being taught to operate machines, the critics said, when they should be spending time reading and writing. The system was too practical. Some said the school day was too long for children and that the schools should not be used as neighborhood community centers. Some were disturbed over the effect of a system where students had just a locker and not a permanent seat. The Wirt system became a major issue in the New York City mayoral race in 1917, where one candidate promised a seat for every school child if he got elected. He won, and Wirt's system never took hold in New York. But in the 1910s, the Gary schools were still the most unique public school system in America.
Like many American schools, those in Gary were segregated. There was one exception. Frable was built on the south side, in the center of the district where the immigrants and the African Americans of Gary lived. It was the city's one integrated school. But even at Frable, there was some segregation. Black students were banned from the swimming pool and from some school activities such as band. Some student clubs were also segregated. Gary was home to over 50 different nationalities. It was at Frable where the school system tried to mold the children of immigrants into Americans, to teach them the American way. And in the early 20th century, racial segregation was part of the American way. 1913 was another election year. It was another chance for U.S. Steel and the Republicans to get rid of Tom Knotts. During his 4 years as mayor, Knotts was arrested 14 times by the Republican Sheriff's Department. He was charged with election fraud, perjury, and bribery, among other things. But he was never convicted. In fact, he was never even brought to trial on any of the charges. But the constant negative publicity, led by the Gary Tribune, hurt his image. The Republican candidate was Roswell O. Johnson. He was a likable man who mingled well among the businessmen of the North Side and the workers on the South Side. Many in Gary wanted the South Side cleaned up, to shut down the taverns and stop the gambling and vice. Mayor Knott said the city was doing the job, but voters didn't believe him. On Election Day, Johnson was a winner. Gary's first mayor had been defeated.
It was a victory for U.S. Steel. Tom Knotts was gone, and their candidate was in the mayor's office. Mayor Johnson appointed Plant Superintendent William Gleason to head the city park system. The chief inspector for the Gary Land Company became chief of police. The chief engineer at the plant became head of the city council, and Captain Norton, the head of the Mills Land Company, became an advisor to the mayor. Some people said he was the real mayor of the city.
Gary was prosperous in the 1910s, but in 1914, it got a lesson on the dangers of being a one-industry town. The nation had a recession that year. Hundreds in Gary lost their jobs at the steel mill.
There is no work here to be had. No matter how willing the heads of families may be to find employment that would enable them to provide the bare necessities of life.
At night, children from the south side walked to the more comfortable north side homes to rummage through the trash cans for food. The school's truant officer estimated that hundreds of children were eating from scraps found in garbage cans. There were obvious concerns about the health of the poor. The Wirt school system was designed to give regular medical exams to children. That helped. But what really helped was a war in Europe. World War I was beginning, and the steel mill was suddenly busy. Times were good again, and many people quickly forgot the lesson about the problem of being a one-industry town.
There was drinking, gambling, and prostitution on the south side. A lot of people wanted it shut down. In 1914, Mayor Johnson said if the criminals didn't get out of Gary, he'd have the police haul them into court.
An attempt is being made to bring back slot machines. Old gambling joints are reopening. I am determined now, as I've always been, that these conditions shall not continue in Gary.
It wasn't good enough for U.S. Steel officials in Gary. They felt Johnson talked tough but did nothing. So they supported William Hodges for mayor in 1917. Hodges had resigned as Johnson City's attorney in protest of widespread vice. Hodges won, and in January, he was sworn in as Gary's third mayor in as many elections.
Gary was not slowing down. It still didn't have enough housing to take care of everyone's needs. On the north side, builders were busy putting up homes for those who could afford them. The Gary Land Company built some homes just for blacks. The development on Carolina Street was Gary's first segregated housing. But most African Americans lived on the south side, along with the immigrants. Sometimes it was very crowded. 100 Greeks lived in a 3-story frame house on the back of this lot. But the worst were the row houses. Each building had 8 to 10 apartments. Each apartment had 2 rooms. Each room was about 10 square feet. Sometimes they'd be built on adjoining lots, with all the doors opening into a 3-foot-wide passageway between the buildings. All the families in these row houses shared one toilet and one water pump in the backyard. It was the worst disaster in Gary's history. The Hagenbach-Wallace Circus had just finished a show in Michigan City in the early morning of June 22, 1918. The performers were heading to Hammond for their next show. They were on Gary's west side, just a few miles from their destination, when the train collided with an empty troop train. The newspaper reports say there was a huge explosion.
Immediately after the impact, which sounded like a clap of thunder, the show coaches caught fire from an acetylene lighting system which had been destroyed in the collision. The show coaches were reduced to kindling wood. Women and men were crushed and burned in the ruins. Heads, arms, and legs stuck out from the side of the wreckage as the flames licked the bodies of the victims, some of whom were still living, but were being slowly cremated.
There were about 260 circus people on the train. The injured were rushed to every hospital in the area, including the steel company's hospital. The morgues were also filled. First reports said 46 had died. The final number of dead was 85. Many were so badly burned their bodies were never identified. They were laid to rest in a special section of Woodlawn Cemetery in Forest Park, Illinois, a section called Showman's Rest.
That same year, many Gary residents wore a mask. They were protecting themselves from the worst epidemic in the city's history. The flu epidemic of 1918 hit much of America, killing thousands. In a military camp, soldiers were dying at a rate of nearly 3 an hour. In Philadelphia, over 400 died in a 2-day period. In Gary, most businesses stayed open. But schools, churches, movie theaters, and other public places closed their doors in an effort to keep the virus from spreading. 64 people died in Gary from the flu in the month of October. With the worst living conditions in town, Gary's black community was hardest hit by the epidemic. Paul Drimley was a 12-year-old boy who lived upstairs from a black-owned funeral home.
Many colored people who came up from the south died from Spanish influenza that winter. The winter was bad and they got sick quick. There was a funeral every day. We could hear the people crying downstairs in the chapel from our flat.
By November, schools and other public places were open again. But for several weeks to come, Some, like these library employees, still wore masks to protect themselves from catching the flu.
The flu epidemic didn't keep everyone home. Some businesses, like model clothiers, offered influenza specials.
We are taking advantage of schools being closed on account of the flu to offer an opportunity to mothers to make a substantial saving. For one day only, tomorrow, Friday only, any boy suit in our stock at 20% discount.
A flu epidemic, a train wreck, and a war were all major headlines in 1918, but the one event which really hit Gary in the gut was Prohibition.
At the hour of 12, 177 saloon keepers in Gary will lock the doors, wash up the glasses, take off 177 white aprons, and lay them away, because tomorrow morning they will awake free men, for Indiana's bone-dry law goes into effect with the close of April 2nd.
It was now illegal to buy or sell liquor in the state, so a lot of Gary residents took the train to Illinois to get their liquor, where it was still legal for another year. And within days, bootleggers went to work, like the police and firemen who posed for this picture. Many in Gary got a laugh out of the Prohibition law. Over the next 15 years, Prohibition would have a major impact on life in Gary and the city's reputation.
Early Gary was called the Magic City of Steel. In a time when America was becoming the industrial leader of the world, America's greatest industrial plant was built here. The new city could also be proud of an innovative and internationally renowned school system. This was a modern American city, but the roots of future problems were growing. Seeds were sown for the development of vice, crime, and corrupt government. Housing could not meet the demand, so shabby homes were built, and an urban ghetto was forming, populated by low-paid immigrants and African Americans. Racial segregation was established, and almost everyone in town depended on one industry for their survival. The world was changing. A world war was raging in Europe. Soon, Gary and the rest of America would be part of that war. It was thousands of miles away, but the war would have a big impact on the Magic City of Steel. Gary,